slide, I'm going to tell you about a trip that I was an associate leader on for AMC Adventure Travel, my first hike as an associate leader in September of last year. I certainly want to give credit to the leader who trained me and who set up this hike with me, Jeannie Blauner, who is a long-time adventure travel leader. Unfortunately, about a month before the hike, she fell and fractured her tibia. And so at the last minute, another seasoned leader, Rami Haddad, he had to step in. And so it was Rami and I that led this trip in September of last year. So first and foremost, okay, my slides are not moving.
Keith, can you click with your mouse in the middle of the slide and then it should
Oh,
toggle
right.
on?
That was the missing point. Okay, now we're good to go. Okay, should be good now, Mark. I think I'm on top of it now. I've cracked it.
You got it, Keith.
So here's my talk outline. First of all, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the geography of the region where we hiked, just to let you know where Albania is, for example. Then I'm going to give you a little overview of the route, then our team, our journey, say a bit about our accommodation, most importantly, talk about the food, a little bit about the local culture, something about wildlife, some reflections on the trip generally, and then questions. And please feel free to put questions into the chat. And Mark is going to coordinate feeding those questions back to me at the end of my talk. At the end of my talk as well, you can also hold up your hand on the screen and ask questions then. So first of all, moving forward, so onto the geography of the region. So Albania is somewhere in the sort of middle of Europe to the east of the boot of Italy. So if you know your geography, you've got the familiar boot of Italy coming down there on the left-hand side of the slide. Then you've got the Adriatic Sea, and then you've got a whole collection of countries, many of which were part of the old Yugoslavia, but in recent years have got their independence, and you've got Serbia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, Croatia, and there you see Albania, Montenegro, and Kosovo. And it was two of those countries that we visited. We visited Albania and Montenegro. We wanted to go into Kosovo, but Kosovo is sort of on the sort of blacklist at the moment from the insurance perspective. There must be some issues there. So although our trip we were originally going to go to Kosovo, we were prevented from going there. Um, the part of Albania and Montenegro where we hiked is shown by this ellipse here. And in that ellipse, there is a relatively new trail that was put in place not too many years ago called the Peaks of the Balkans Trail. And that's shown here by this red line. So it starts well, it depends where you start. It goes from Albania into Kosovo, into Montenegro. And that's where we did most of our hiking. The capital of Albania is Tirana, and that's where we flew into. That's where we met. Just to give you some idea of size, Albania is about the size of Massachusetts and has a population of 2.7 million. Montenegro is about the size of Connecticut and has a population of about 600,000. So Tirana is the capital, that's where we flew into, and that has a population of about 500,000. So here's that Peaks of the Balkan Trail in a little bit more detail. As I said, it's a 119-mile circular trail created in 2012. It passes through the Accursed Mountains. I'll say a little more later about why they're called the Accursed Mountains. And as I said, and you can see the dotted yellow line in the map shows the borders between Montenegro, Kosovo, and Albania. And you can see how this red trail sort of snakes in and out of those three countries. It's a very beautiful region, lots of mountains, valleys, high passes, forests, pastures. And the sign that you see on the trail is this sort of red, white, red blaze that you see on lots of trees and rocks marking the way. Um, I'm not going to take you day by day where we went. Suffice it to say that we started down in the bottom in Valbona, where the number two is, and we worked our way in a counterclockwise circle. We went up through Seremi to Doberdal, then we went up to Babino Polje, and then Plav, and then Vusanji, and then down to Theth before we went back to Tirana. This was our group. So we were a group of 16, two leaders, and 14 participants. And my better half, who I'll call Judith because that's her name, Judith is taking the photograph here. And she has this thing about getting everybody to line up in their jackets in something, call it approaching a rainbow. So we struggle a couple of times with colors, but for the most part, we've usually got a lot of reds, a lot of oranges and yellows, and some blues. So generally, we can make something that approaches a rainbow.
Pretty cool.
And we had some married couples on here. We had some single couples that were hiking together, and we had a mum and daughter on this hike. So we had a good group of people. So we started off, as I said, by all flying into Tirana, which is the capital of Albania. And we spent a night in a hotel there. Our opening night, we had our opening dinner. And the next morning, we had a city tour, which began in this large plaza in the center of Tirana called Skanderberg Square, which is this massive sort of paved area with rock from all over Albania and surrounded by some very interesting buildings. And I'll come to the one in the center there that looks like a person in a minute. The square is named after Skanderberg, and Skanderberg is the national hero. So this guy was originally from the region. He was whisked off to the Ottoman court down in Turkey and trained down there to fight for the Ottomans. But he ended up deserting them and going back to his native land and then leading an uprising against the Ottomans in order to free Albania. So he is very much their national hero. The statue on the left here is in that big square that's named after him. We went to a museum elsewhere where the bust in the middle panel was taken from, and that building that I showed you on the edge of the square is meant to be him, and you can see his profile. That's called the Tirana Rock or the Skanderberg Rock. There were some very cool buildings in Tirana, some very interesting architecture. The one on the right-hand side is called the Hoxha Pyramid, and this was named after the communist premier who ruled, a dictator who ruled over Albania from 1940 on into, I think it was the 1980s. And this was built to house a museum that was going to be dedicated to him. But as he rather fell from grace after the communists were removed, it's now no longer a museum, and I think it's a conference center. But it's got all these stairs that go up from several sides up to a viewpoint from the top. So just a very interesting building. Um, Lots of mosques because 50% of the population in Albania are Muslim, but also a lot of Catholicism. And many of you will know that although Teresa spent a lot of her time in India, she was actually born in Albania, and we went to a cathedral that is dedicated to her. Now, another thing you see a lot of throughout Albania, and these are remnants of the communist era, are these bunkers, and they are absolutely everywhere. In this country, the size of Massachusetts, there are over 250,000 of these concrete bunkers, and they were built by this Ava Hoxha, who was the dictator, communist leader from during this era from 1944 to 1999, and they were never ever used. The country was paranoid about being invaded. The little on the top left is what they called one of these mushroom bunkers, and this would have housed just a couple of soldiers, and they were there as a very defensive ploy to the potential invasion. The larger bunker on the right-hand side, in the center of Tirana, now houses a big museum, which is really dedicated to the surveillance police, the secret police, and the era when a lot of political thought was repressed and suppressed. And of course, a lot of people disappeared, and a lot of people were thrown into jail and never heard from. And there's a museum there in the center of Tirana that we visited, which didn't make for the most enjoyable museum because you realize what a terribly repressive regime that was. Um, so after our day in in Tirana, we got on a bus the next day and we drove towards the peaks of the Balkans, and our stop was a place called Schroeder in Albania, where we had a nice walk around the town. It had rained hard that day, but we still had a nice walk along the town of Schroeder, a lot of outdoor cafes, another beautiful mosque, and we stayed at a rather lovely hotel which dates from the late 1600s. It had been the residence of a very wealthy merchant, now turned into a beautiful hotel with a courtyard, very old, and inside there was this massive open grill on which they cooked a lot of our food, including these very lovely pizzas. So that was a nice stop. The next day, we were up very early to catch a bus to take us to a ferry. And then we spent 2.5 hours going across a large lake, Kumani Lake. You can see our ferry there, or something like our ferry in the bottom left. This is a 30-mile long man-made lake that powers a hydroelectric facility, but it was our first glimpse of these accursed mountains. So here we were riding up this quite narrow, almost Norwegian fjord-like journey, and surrounded by these huge peaks going up either side of us. Now, why are they called the Accursed Mountains? Well, there's legend that says the devil escaped from hell one day and went on a day of mischief and carved these mountains out of the rock. There's also a legend that a woman and her children cursed the mountains when she struggled to find water in them when trying to cross them. And then probably the one that's the truest, and that is that Slavic soldiers who were forced to cross these mountains used to curse them because they were so difficult to cross, because they get snow and it gets cold and it gets windy. So probably that's why they're called the Accursed Mountains, but I think the Devil one is the most interesting. So anyway, we had a nice 2.5 hour ride on this ferry. It was a car ferry, so there were a lot of trucks on it, a lot of cars, and a lot of people. I don't think any of us had a seat, but it was such a beautiful day. You can see the weather was glorious, and we had a very nice boat ride. At the end of that boat ride, we were taken by bus to our first hotel. We should have been staying at a guest house that night, but there was a little snafu with the booking. So the guest house, however, managed to get us into what was really quite a new and modern hotel. And this area of this Peaks of the Balkans Trail, this town of Valbona, is very much sort of getting on the tourist bandwagon. You could see a lot of roads and a lot of facilities and a lot of new hotels being put in. So this was quite a modern hotel where we stayed, in fact, for the first couple of nights. And in the morning, this hotel faced these beautiful accursed mountains, which are all limestone. So it's all rock that was evidently at one point the bottom of a huge sea, and all the limestone was created by the critters that were laid down onto the bottom of the ocean. And then the plate pushed the mountains up and created the Accursed Mountains. If any of you have ever been to the Dolomites in northern Italy, the scenery is very similar. It's a very sort of white rock that really shines at you. It's absolutely beautiful. So, so that hike into that Valbona Valley was our first day's hike, just a 5 mile hike, fairly flat hike along a river. Um, the next several days, though, we did some serious hiking, and you'll see that day four, our second day of hiking, we did a 9.3 mile hike and ascended 4,000 feet to get to the highest that we got on this trip, which was a little over 8,000 feet. And then you'll see we had a series of back-to-back hikes over the next several days. And ultimately, I think we hiked about 75 miles and did about an accumulation of about 25,000 feet of elevation gain. But our weather was always pretty good. We only had one day of rain. The rest of the time, we were really hiking in beautiful sunshine. So that first day on the route en route to the big hike, the big peak, we initially went up to a pass, the Rosny Pass, and that's where we looked out at these accursed mountains and just spectacular views. As I say, very white stone that absolutely glistens. You'll see what we were hiking on, a lot of sort of grassy areas. I'll show you some pictures in a minute of some of the trails, but from this viewpoint, we looked out and you could see all these mountains. We looked across into Kosovo and across into Montenegro. So again, these are views from the peak, from the top of that mountain, which was a big sort of grassy hillock on the top. It wasn't a jagged peak. And as I say, we're at that point we were at 8,280 feet. Here we are going down. So this gives you an idea of the sorts of trails that we were walking on. So a little bit of scree to walk across, but nothing that was overly challenging. Poles were useful. We'd encouraged everybody to take poles. You see, everybody's wearing sun hats because we were treated to a lot of sunshine. And the trails had switchbacks as well. So nothing was ever sort of a grueling pitch up to the top. And here's another view of, again, several of us or several of the group following this trail that you can see snaking its way through the valley, surrounded by these high peaks of this limestone, some trees at the end of the valley, but for the most part, we didn't see a lot of trees. Um, One of the hikes, we ended up hiking up to this little shelter, which is lived in during the summer months by the shepherd and his wife. This all gets completely snowed over in the winter, but in the summer, as I say, the shepherd and his wife live here, and here is the shepherd's wife, and she made a nice yogurt from the sheep's milk, and she also goes and went and picked natural blueberries. So we had some coffee with her and some of her yogurt and blueberries. Now, the gentleman standing next to her, Aranetti, was our guide. So all of this trip had been planned using an outfitter in the country, a guy aptly named Adriatic. But literally the day before the hike, Adriatic was doing something at his parents' house to do with a solar panel, fell off a ladder, and he broke his wrist. So, this trip, what with a broken leg to one of the original leaders and then the broken wrist to the guide, it didn't start off well. But Aranetti turned out to be a late substitute, and he did a really great job and spoke excellent English and had walked these trails many, many times, knew the lady here, hence his embrace with someone who I think he's drunk her coffee and eaten her yogurt many, many times. So we did see a lot of sheep. So that was the main wildlife that we saw, and this is the flock that was tended by the lady I just showed you and her husband. So I think after the 2 nights we stayed at that fairly modern hotel that I showed you, the next night we stayed at a more typical guest house. And this was what we saw in many places where old farmhouses had been converted into guest houses. And as you'll see in the picture on the photo on the right, some purpose-built sort of hiking chalets had been added to the farmhouse main building, and this was going on, I think, all over Albania. Albania, I think, is opening up after all those communist eras. I think people are seeing it as a new place to hike. It's certainly not as crowded as, say, Switzerland and France and that region. I hiked the Tour de Mont Blanc a few years ago, and that's certainly not a wilderness experience. You're very often on a trail with 100 other people. It was much less sparsely populated where we were hiking in Albania. Looking inside the building here, looking at the panels on the right-hand side, you can see the typical bedroom. We were generally sharing rooms. Sometimes people were doubling up. Sometimes it was 5 people to a room. Sometimes it was 2 couples sharing a room. So we didn't really know the mix until we arrived. And then we had to divvy up the group. And I remember this particular guest house was interesting because we had to move a bed up 2 flights of stairs in order to, and we assisted in doing that. So that was quite fun. That's a great sort of a group builder when you have to figure out how you're going to get a bed up the stairs. Always very interesting because everybody has a different approach to how you're going to do it. Down panel below, you see the typical dining room facility that we had. Um, and on the left-hand panel, a typical breakfast. So we ate a lot of cheese, a lot of feta cheese, I think it was, a lot of tomatoes, a lot of cucumber. There was also a porridge and bread and some kind of jam or preserve there. And this was a very typical breakfast that we would have. And then we would make our lunch from what was left over from breakfast. So there was always extra food, extra bread, and we'd make our own sandwich and put it in a bag and then set off on our trail for the day. We moved on to another guest house, and this one was a little bit more. There were more buildings at this one because this was actually on the peaks of the Balkans Trail and was very close to the intersection of Albania, Montenegro, and Kosovo. So there was quite a complex of buildings here, and you can see the variety. There was also a tent site here, and there were a lot of young people, um, a lot of students, a lot of people sort of doing backpacking that were going through this particular guest house, which had the coolest beer fridge I think I've ever seen. So the way in which they cooled the beer here was basically by piping the mountain stream, really cold stream water, into what must have been an old fridge. So you can see all the pipe work here and the sign, which you won't be able to read, but it basically says close the door, close the water, turn off the water before you open the door. So if you were to open the door when that water was going at full, you'd just get completely drenched. So before you got your beer out, you had to turn the tap, turn off the water, reach in, grab your beer, and then turn the water back on. It was clearly very popular because there was a huge, trash bin here full of empty beer bottles. This particular night, we had the views of the moon and the stars were spectacular. We were in a lovely valley, and were treated to, as I say, a beautiful moon. The next day, we had perhaps the steepest climb, and this is myself with my better half, and we climbed up to the top of this tree Kofiri, which basically means three peaks summit. On this intersection here, where we've got this marker, this is where Kosovo, Montenegro, and Albania meet. So we were standing right on the intersection, and here we're at 7,762 feet. As I said, it had been bit of a steep pitch to get up to here, and you can see everybody was very, very glad of their poles here. We'd actually ditched our packs a little bit lower down and then climbed this last steep pitch to get up here. But the trail was never dangerous. It was never sheer. It was never anything that presented any real problems. You just had to watch your footing because some of this scree was apt to sort of give away below your feet, a little bit like walking on marbles. Um, every day, our larger bag was moved from hotel to hotel, guest house to guest house, wherever. Generally moved for the most part on a truck, but on this particular day, they were moved by mule. And we had made some arrangements with our outfitter that if anybody wanted to skip a day of hiking, they could ride with the truck for 30 euros. But if you wanted to ride with the mule, it was 100 euros. So we'd already negotiated that, but no one ended up needing to take a mule or a truck. What was particularly interesting about this day was that there'd been a change in the guest house we were going to, but nobody had told the guy driving the mules. So all our bags went to the wrong guest house. But such is life, and we were able to communicate with where the bags had gone and get them pretty quickly trucked over to the right guest house. Another view of some of the trails that we were taking. You can see this is like a ridge on an area where there were no trees. But then you would drop down into a valley, and all of a sudden you'd find yourself walking through a beautiful valley. You can see this herd of goats here. Um, this was the next guest house that we stayed at. And you can see this one was very modern. It had only recently been built. You can see the bedrooms there, all very clean, very shipshape, very nice. Showers, no problems at all. It was excellent food here as well. The next day, this was another peak that we went up right on the border of Albania and Montenegro. This gives you an idea of the steepness and again the trail, the type of trail that we were going up in order to get to the top of this particular peak, 6,700 feet with beautiful views. On the way, we also passed some beautiful lakes. Obviously, this area was having, with these mountains having been pushed up, the glaciers then came in several, whatever, million years later and started to carve a lot of the landscape that we now see, and some of these lakes were left by the glaciers. This was a particularly beautiful lake in which some of us had a swim. And some of us wished we hadn't had a swim because the water was pretty cold. That was in Montenegro. Here was another lake in Albania that we hiked up to, up where in the northeast where I hike. We call these tarns. This is a tarn, a glacier lake. And then this was one of our last guest houses in a beautiful little village called Theth. This guest house has been going for a long time, and this is a very popular region. Got a very iconic church that we had a look inside. I think that's about 150 years old. Um, but you see people going about their normal life. You know, it's not all tourism. These were people that were just farming. This gentleman here was sharpening his scythe, and the lady tried to speak to this lady. She did speak a little bit of English. Obviously, I spoke absolutely no Albanian, but we did manage to communicate, and I think she was off feeding the chickens this morning. We went on a little walk around Theth, saw this beautiful cottage with wood presumably prepared for the winter, ready for to burn on the stove in the winter. And then we also were taken inside this lock-in tower. So this is something to do with the culture in Albania, where there really was for many years a kind of an eye for an eye culture. If you were in a feud between your family and another family, and you know a death had happened, someone had been murdered, then it was an eye for an eye, and the sort of culture and the laws allowed you to kill someone in the other person's family. And sometimes people could take refuge into what were called these lock-in towers. And so if you were being pursued by someone who was seeking retribution for a death in their family, you could take refuge in this lock-in tower and hope either the person chasing you, you know, died or whatever. But that's what this was. And we were taken inside this tower. This lock-in tower was over 400 years old. The end of this journey, one of our last hikes, we did visit this beautiful pool high up in the mountains. This was called Blue Eye, for obvious reasons, but this water was extremely cold. I did go and have a swim in this. Um, my better half didn't because sticking her toes in was enough for her to think, no, I'm not going in there. It was very cold. And this was our last guest house, so this one not as purpose-built as some of the others I showed you. This one clearly an old farmhouse where the rooms were being converted in order to take advantage of the increase in tourism. So here we are, just showing you that map again of that peaks of the Balkans, just working my way round counterclockwise. We started in Valbona. That beer fridge was in Doberdal, which is very close to the intersection. You see the intersection of Kosovo, Montenegro, and Albania. We went up to Plav, we went across to Visinji, and we eventually ended up at Theth, which is where that lock-in tower and the church was. I couldn't resist showing you this photo because I photographed this guy who'd been collecting mushrooms. I've never seen mushrooms like these. They're more like sombrero hats, and the guy had a whole armful, and we met him on one of our hikes. Excuse me. Okay. So, food. Most important to talk about food. So, this was a typical meal that we would get. You can just spot everything in here: the cucumber, the tomatoes, the olives, the hummus, the yogurt, the savories. This was a very typical kind of food that you would get in a restaurant. Here, some beautiful salads. You know, all of this salad was growing in the garden the morning of the day you ate it. Similarly, the aubergines, bottom right, sorry, the courgettes in the yogurt in the bottom right, and then over on the left-hand side, I think that was peppers in some sort of yogurt. All beautifully fresh, beautifully fresh. Now, on the day before we left, we had a real treat. We went to quite a famous restaurant that is pursuing the sort of agri-tourism, whereby all the food that you eat in the restaurant is grown locally. The restaurant actually sits in what was an old communist jail, but it is now quite a feature of this part of Albania, and you can see just the beautiful food that we had, how it was beautifully plated, whether it was the cheeses and the meats over in the bottom left, the tomatoes in the middle, and then a series of desserts here with the fresh fruit.
I'm just crushing it.
Here's some this is one of the old bunkers that some artist had obviously found a big spoon and decided to stick it in the top and then rename it the ham bunker. But this is an example of one of these bunkers that we just saw all the time. You would walk into villages. Sometimes they were storing farming equipment in them. Sometimes they were small shops. Sometimes animals were living in them, but they were absolutely everywhere. But I digress from the food. This food just kept on coming. It really was a delight to eat at this place. And almost like a conveyor belt production crew in place, making and plating all of this food. And as I said, all the food is grown locally. And so we were taken into one of their storage areas. These were actually jail cells at the time of the communist era, but now they're used to store the food. And you can see all the cheeses here, and the sausage, and the wine, and then some kind of preserve here that had all been jarred and ready. And you could buy this stuff. Um, Last place we went to before we headed back for our flight home was a place called Kruger. We stayed top right. We stayed in quite a modern hotel, this Hotel Panorama, right next to a mosque, which was very interesting until the call for prayer at 4 o'clock in the morning. So you weren't necessarily happy to hear that, but obviously one's very respectful of the culture. There was an old picture on the left-hand side shows an old church tower, which is all sort of propped up because there'd been an earthquake here a few years ago, and they've sort of banded that to try and stop it all falling down. Bottom right is a big museum that was very much dedicated to the history of Albania, and a lot was said about that Skanderberg character that is their national hero. Wildlife, well, this was the best I could do, I'm afraid. Dogs, geese, cows, and sheep. There wasn't anything spectacular about the wildlife, except this dog was interesting because he insisted on lying in a puddle. Don't ask me why, but that's where That's where he was spending his afternoon. The geese were near that lovely restaurant. The cow was just grazing amongst some washing in Theth, and these were the sheep we saw on the trek. It wasn't all play. Every now and then we needed a few a few bit of shut eye. So I captured a couple of my colleagues here just taking in a little snooze after one of our hikes. But on one of the peaks, we had the highest yoga class in Albania on that particular day. So, for those of you that are into yoga, this is a Warrior 2. I'm reliably informed. And this is another yoga pose from the same group. So we bonded fantastically. I mean, I find this AMC people have a tremendous affinity for making a good group, and we all bonded, and we were all great friends at the end of it, and we've kept in touch subsequently. You always get the odd exhibitionist on these trails. So we had Pete here who insisted on doing his yoga pose. I think that's the tree. He did that on the top of one of the markers between, I think that was Albania and Montenegro. Then Sarah doing her jump and being captured midair. And then Deb needed no excuse to do a handstand, a headstand, and we photographed her doing that on many, many occasions. But again, a terrific group. So, last slide. So, some reflections of the trip. Just breathtaking, I say majestic and diverse mountain scenery, just spectacular mountains, and just worth it just to see that. The high passes I showed you, the valleys, and the beautiful, pristine lakes, the most wonderful countryside. A rich cultural history, which we had a little opportunity to delve into with our tour around Tirana and learning about Skanderberg. Very welcoming and hospitable locals. They really couldn't do enough to help us. Very, very kind people. We stayed in, as I said, a lot of comfortable family-run guest houses. The food was simple, but it was hearty, and there was always plenty of it. We connected, as I've said before, with our fellow hikers and with our locals, and most importantly, we made a lot of memories and friendships. And as I say, we're keeping in touch with one another um, uh, right now.